It's hard to remember now, what with the onslaught of like-minded series and podcasts that followed in its wake, but when the This American Life podcast serial debuted in October 2014, true crime as a genre of entertainment was typically relegated to late-night cable time slots at best. It was the sort of guilty pleasure viewing you only reveal to your significant other once vulnerable enough to bear the entirety of your gluttonous, entertainment-gorging soul. Serial changed everything. Little more than 1 year after its debut, episodes of the incredibly popular podcast, which centered on the 1999 murder of Hae Min Lee, an 18-year-old student at Woodlawn High School in Baltimore, and, more specifically, the questionable circumstances surrounding the investigation into a murder conviction of her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed, had been downloaded more than 80 million times. As is often the case in today's 24/7 news cycle, the majority of listeners likely filed Syed's case to the back of their minds. Not Amy Berg. The Academy Award-nominated documentary filmmaker couldn't let it go. Instead, the 48-year-old spent nearly the past 3+ years documenting Syed's fight for a new trial, well as digging beyond even serial's reporting into Lee's murder. The result is the Case Against Adnan Syed, a gripping, unsettling, and entirely engrossing 4-part HBO documentary series that premiered on March 10th. Berg is no stranger to the true crime genre. She's already completed several acclaimed true crime documentary films, including West of Memphis, which documents the story of the West Memphis Three, who were convicted as teenagers of the 1993 murder of 3 boys in West Memphis, Arkansas, as well as Deliver Us from Evil, centered on the sex abuse cases in the Roman Catholic Church. But while she admits the genre is thrilling to her, it's largely because of the investigative work. It's the way in which she believes films like The Case Against Adnan Syed can expose the flaws in our criminal justice system that continues to energize her work. The beginning of injustice starts right here in these kinds of stories. Berg tells Esquire.com in an in-depth conversation ahead of the HBO series premiere that touches on her initial attraction to Syed's case, how she kept her own opinions in check, and why she believes our society is so enamored with the true crime genre. ESQ serial, and specifically the work of its host journalist Sarah Koenig, was in-depth to say the least. Though by taking on this documentary I'd think you were convinced there was still more left to unpack in Syed's case. Amy Berg: I'm a filmmaker first. For me to tell a visual story, something has to have really piqued my emotional curiosity as well as my true crime sensibility. Reading Hae's journal, it really moved me. And then after talking to some of her friends, I felt like there was a reason to put this into a film series, just to understand the cultural context and to see people's faces. That to me warranted a show, for sure. But also there was a post-conviction hearing a few months after I started this film. So we picked up where serial left off. They did such a great job at creating the interest and picking the case apart, and I felt like we had an opportunity to go even farther into what happened after serial, which is almost as interesting as the podcast. One thing that became clear from the outset of the series is how much hurt and a lack of peace still exists for both those close to Adnan and Hae. Oh yeah? Stepping into Adnan's mom's daycare center for the first time I met her, or stepping into Adnan's friend Rabia's Chaudhry house, or meeting up with Adnan's friends and Hae's family friends. I just felt like the pain is still sitting there. It's still real, so it was a challenge for me to jump into it. How long have you been working on this? 3.5 years. Since October of 2015. Is that a standard timeline for this sort of film? Yes. It's standard. I don't think I've ever made a film in less than 2 years. I'm going to take that back. I did this dog series and our whole production schedule was less than a year. We made 6 films. But that was very different. I am always the person that's like, let's do it. We'll get it done in a year and a half. And it just never happens. On this film I had to go to the president of HBO at the time, Sheila Nevins, and tell her that I needed to go on a hiatus so we could continue to investigate and not have the same schedule and expectations. Because there was still more reporting to do. Because we wouldn't have had the story. We wouldn't have had enough time. Especially with these kinds of films where there's a huge history, a 20-year history and a case. You have to really know everything every time you interview somebody or you're not going to be able to put the pieces together. It's very time-intensive. You're certainly no stranger to this sort of project, but I imagine one of the challenges is reacting in real time as new developments play out in the case. Of course. And it always brings an extra challenge when the case is high-profile. I have tackled this sort of thing in past films before. You're right. But we've become even more of a headline culture than when I first started making films. So the challenge has been to examine the gray areas and to see what another potential narrative could look like and to really feel your way through a story emotionally. So that is my thing, I guess. Taking something like this and creating a film that can help people understand in a different way. Which is why I wanted to start with Hay's journals, and to really get to understand who Hae Min Lee was. Because my understanding of Hae Min Lee was very limited up to that point. Absolutely. Serial only scratched the surface of Hae's life before her murder. Right, as a young woman who lost her life, I wanted to really give her the proper treatment in the film. It's not an uncommon problem with true crime as a genre. The victim and the nuances of his or her life often get shortchanged. Right, and it's much easier to humanize a person thought their own words than, say, through the Greven family. Also, because there is a sense of injustice in the criminal justice system. I think true crime junkies tend to believe the system is wrong. Because it is a lot of the time. So it's hard to have sympathy for both sides of the story. So by Hae's own words, and the stories that are told by her friends, I feel like she really became this beautiful young life that got lost. True crime as a genre has been around for decades. But the most recent wave seemed to be amped up in a major way as a result of Serial. Why do you think these sorts of cases are striking such a nerve with viewers? Well, I'm a junkie for it too. But I think when you see one case where a prosecutor maybe doesn't introduce evidence that could have possibly supported an exoneration or not convicted somebody, or when you hear stories about a wrong diagnosis and just junk science, all that stuff makes you dubious of the system. When I finished making West of Memphis, I remember thinking, I don't think I can ever do this again, because it was so painful going up against the state of Arkansas and challenging them on the facts. And trying to get information out of the people that should have the information. It's just kind of scary to feel that they might not be able to fight for themselves in a situation where one might not have committed a crime. Specifically, as a filmmaker, one of the challenges in making a film such as this has to be not passing judgment, or, for that matter, taking sides and letting your own biases supersede the facts. The question is, can you be objective when you're trying to tell a story like this? And I think we were just following the case the state presented. So we were very objective. We went word for word on the things that they presented in the trial to convict Adnan Syed. And there were a lot of problems with a lot of those things they presented. So the objectivity lies in trying to find out why they presented those things and how they discredited each other. And then what else exists in order to try and find out what really happened in this case. We get a little bit closer in episode 4 to the evidence, so you'll see that when that airs. But objectivity has to be about the facts. It can't just rely on Adnan's friend and star witness, J. Wild's statements. Especially when his statements conflict with each other every time he speaks. So you have to look beyond that. And in this trail, they really didn't do that. One of the most fascinating aspects of this case is how it was framed in the context of Adnan and Hayes' respective ethnicities and cultural backgrounds. It was hard not feeling that racial biases and prejudices may have come into play when convicting Adnan. Totally. I remember the first time I interviewed Baltimore Detective Daryl Massey. We were doing a lot of research into what was going on in 1999 in the streets in terms of crime, and we were fascinated by some stories that are loosely in the film about Korean convenience shop owners and violence against them on the street, which was mostly perpetrated by African Americans. It was kind of like a street war between blacks and Koreans at the time. I remember asking Detective Massey just how difficult it was when there was a crime that they were trying to investigate with a Korean family, and he looked at me and said, "It's very difficult because there's a language barrier." And that statement really hit me because it just made me realize that there were probably things that Hayes' family didn't understand that the police needed to ask. Like, why are Hayes' pager records nowhere in this case file? She had a pager. Everyone talked about it. They all used to page each other. Little things that could have painted a much more thorough picture might have just been missed based on a language barrier. And that's a big deal. The success of a documentary like this, of course, relies a great deal on the participation of not only the central characters but also the peripheral ones. Rabia Chaudhry, perhaps Adnan's greatest advocate, and a producer on the film, surely then was a help here. Then again, she's of course biased in her feelings on the case. I'm thinking when you're dealing with someone like her, you have to be delicate about how much you feature them as well as let their opinions seep into the film. Correct. Rabia has a very specific position on what happened here. Her position is different than ours because we don't have a personal relationship with Adnan or his family. So we had to maintain a distance in that way because I didn't want to be slanted. For example, there was somebody who called Rabia and had some new information about somebody. I don't want to get too specific on it, but the statements this person made were very damning. We looked at our records and we had reached out to that person and spoken to them a couple of years before, and she had said something very different to us when we spoke to her. So we couldn't include that in the film. It's just about emotionally balancing your passion for advocacy versus storytelling with a more objective eye. I think that's something a less experienced filmmaker could get tripped up by. It's easy to get enticed by information that seems sexy and not question the motives of the source. Totally. And we had two lawyers who were triple-checking people's statements. It was a really big production in that way. We wanted to get it right. An element of Serial I found quite fascinating was the positive rapport between Koenig and Adnan. And I can say the same for the way you engaged with the convicted murderer, Damien Eccles, in West of Memphis. Going into this film then, how much did you concern yourself with access or cooperation from Adnan? And for that matter, does it matter to you in general whether or not you have a rapport with the convicted? Adnan and I both were very intrigued by the podcast. But for me there was something interesting about the fact that Adnan had never tried to come up with another story to defend himself or to say where he was. I had never heard of a case like this where the convicted that people were championing wasn't defending himself in a strong way. I think that's probably part of the allure of Adnan. He's not trying to defend himself. He's never said anything but, "I don't remember. That was just a normal day for me. I didn't do it, so why would I have had to remember any details?" And that's totally not what people want to hear. People want to hear somebody that's screaming, "I didn't do it. I was here," etc. That has to be frustrating for you as a filmmaker. Sure, sometimes I'm like, wait, what about this guy? What about that guy? Why did you do this thing? And Adnan's like, because that's not true. His whole thing is about what actually happened in his experience. I think it makes him seem more honest. I doubt you go into any of your films with an end goal or an expectation of solving the case, but as this case developed over the years, there is now potential for Adnan to get a new trial. How does that affect you as a filmmaker? Well, I thought that was going to happen for the past 2 years. And then I kind of gave up hope on that because the state continues to fight just to even give him a new trial. Adnan is not fighting for anything more than just the opportunity to have a new trial. So that's disheartening. You know, in light of all the new evidence that came out through Serial and the post-conviction hearing, I feel like that definitely warrants a new trial. And the fact that there's a fight over that is kind of ridiculous. Because you would think that a prosecutor would want everyone to feel that he did his job, which is seeking justice. And if there is injustice, then he should be the first person in line to say, wait, let's prove one way or the other so people will feel satisfied. But he's not doing that. He wouldn't even speak to us. I think I sent him 13 emails. I called his office numerous times. He will not go on the record about this case. So there's something strange about that. My guess is you never truly move on after working on a film of this magnitude, but just on a personal level, how do you pivot to your next project? Is it just about waiting to be so inspired by something that you need to start digging in and starting the process once again? I hear you. It's difficult as a documentary filmmaker to do one thing and then move on. Because things sometimes go on hold and there's a lot of overlap. I know this is not the end of this story for us because Adnan is still in prison and he still doesn't have a new trial. So I'm letting it go for now and waiting to see what happens with this next wave.